The WNBA and all the people that follow the WNBA and try to promote the WNBA don't understand that Caitlin Clark's game resonates with us. I say this every day, and every day I got to deal with somebody else dumb in the media. Caitlin Clark's game resonates because she's got flair, she's got flash, she's got style. I said this before, and I'll say this again. We saw Sue Bird's game. We saw Diana Taurasi's game. Kim Mulkey was Sue Bird before Sue Bird became Sue Bird. We've seen it. We haven't seen Caitlin Clark. The folks that cover the NBA, these people that play in the NBA, these people that cover the NBA, there, I said these people, all of you, black, white, green, purple. Why don't you understand a very simple thing? Her game is dynamic. Like Diana Taurasi was like a jackass to Caitlin Clark. Why? Her game is what people are drawn to. And then you go to the personality. Her game is different than any WNBA woman ever.
They'll tell you it was just an accident, a freak play, a cruel twist of fate that ended Caitlin Clark's season before it even had the chance to truly take off. But if you've been paying attention, if you've been watching the games, the headlines, and the silence coming out of the commissioner's office, then you know this wasn't an accident at all. This was a slow-motion disaster, months in the making. And at the very center of it sits one name, Cathy Engelbert. Think about it. The WNBA's brightest star, the single most important player in the history of the league's growth, is sidelined, broken down piece by piece, game by game. And the people in charge want you to believe it was just bad luck? But that story doesn't add up. It doesn't explain the constant targeting. It doesn't explain the ignored fouls. It doesn't explain the carefully crafted press releases that danced around the truth. And it definitely doesn't explain why, when fans and players begged for accountability, all they got in return was polished PR spin. The reality is darker. What you're about to hear isn't speculation pulled out of thin air. It's a trail of evidence, public numbers, blatant patterns, corporate statements that all point to one conclusion. The commissioner of the WNBA celebrated Caitlin Clark while simultaneously leading her to the slaughter. This is the story they don't want you to know. The story that goes beyond highlight reels and ticket sales, into boardrooms, whispered meetings, and decisions made not for the love of the game, but for cold, hard money. Because at its core, Clark's injury isn't just about a superstar being sidelined. It's about betrayal. A betrayal so massive, so deliberate, that it threatens not only Caitlin Clark's career, but the future of the league itself. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. This isn't just an accusation anymore. Engelbert's own actions, her silence, her contradictions, the very words she put on paper, function as a confession. Not a confession in the way you'd expect, with an apology and a promise to do better, but in the way only power can confess, by saying nothing, by focusing on revenue while fans watched their hero crumble. Stay with me, because the story we're about to unpack is far worse than any freak accident. We're going to walk through the celebration, the betrayal, the lies, and finally, the collapse. And by the end, you'll see how one commissioner's obsession with growth and money led directly to the destruction of her league's golden goose. It starts with the celebration, and it ends with a betrayal so deep that fans are now asking if it was incompetence or something much, much darker. Before the betrayal, before the injuries, before the cover-ups, there was celebration. And to understand just how deep the knife would eventually twist, you first have to see the stage that was set. Because in early 2025, the WNBA wasn't just growing, it was exploding. And at the center of it all stood one person, Caitlin Clark. For years, the league had dreamed of this kind of moment. Packed arenas, national television buzz, corporate sponsors lined up to write checks. And it wasn't happening because of a marketing plan or a clever campaign. It was happening because one 23-year-old superstar was changing the game by simply stepping on the court. The Clark effect wasn't just a headline, it was real money. Games that once drew a few thousand were suddenly too big for their venues. Teams were scrambling, moving matchups into massive NBA arenas just to keep up with demand. 6 franchises, 6 of them, had to relocate home games, and every single one of those nights brought in hundreds of thousands in extra revenue. By some estimates, more than $400,000 per game. That's not a bump. That's a revolution. And who was right there in every press conference, every ribbon cutting, every photo op? Commissioner Cathy Engelbert, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with corporate partners, telling anyone who would listen that the league had entered its golden era. She stood on stages bragging about record sponsorship deals, skyrocketing merchandise sales, and the brightest future in women's sports history. But peel back the glossy PR, and the truth is obvious. None of this existed without Caitlin Clark. She wasn't just the star player, she was the foundation of the entire WNBA economy. And Engelbert knew it. She knew every headline, every broadcast, every ticket sold was tied to Clark's name. She wasn't just commissioner at that point, she was the primary beneficiary of the Clark effect. The victory laps, the glowing interviews, the celebration of her leadership, all of it was built on the back of a rookie who had barely been in the league a year. But here's where the story starts to sour, because while Engelbert was smiling for cameras and cashing in the goodwill, something else was happening. Something obvious to fans who actually watched the games. Clark wasn't just being played hard, she was being hunted, and while the commissioner paraded around celebrating growth, she ignored the warning signs. The celebration that Engelbert framed as her crowning achievement was built on a shaky foundation. And deep down, everyone could sense it wouldn't last. Because what happens when you build your empire on one star, and then you fail to protect her?
That's where the celebration ends, and the betrayal begins. This is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because while the commissioner was out front, celebrating record revenues and smiling for cameras, something much uglier was playing out under the bright lights of WNBA arenas. Caitlin Clark wasn't just playing basketball, she was being hunted. From her rookie season, the numbers were undeniable. Clark absorbed an astonishing 20% of all flagrant fouls in the league. Think about that. One player, just one, taking on 1/5 of the most violent fouls in professional basketball? That's not competition. That's a campaign. And it wasn't subtle. Fans saw it. Commentators called it out. Every game seemed to bring another cheap shot, another elbow, another player looking to send a message. Angel Reese of the Chicago Sky became one of the main offenders, dishing out hit after hit, then laughing about it. Laughing while Clark was picking herself up off the hardwood. Laughing while the referees swallowed their whistles. These weren't just hard playoff fouls, they weren't tough defense, they were personal, they were excessive, and they were relentless. Any other workplace, you'd call it what it was, assault. But inside the WNBA, it was brushed off as part of the game. The targeting didn't stop with Reese. By the following season, Clark's teammate Sophie Cunningham, known for her toughness, was forced to step in. She'd already taken her own share of hits, ranking among the top in the league for flagrant fouls absorbed. But watching Clark get hammered night after night pushed her past the breaking point. On the court, Cunningham literally warned referees that if they wouldn't do their jobs and control the chaos, she'd be forced to handle it herself. Imagine that. A player begging officials to enforce the rules because the league office had completely abandoned its responsibility to protect its biggest star. And what did Engelbert do? Nothing. Silence. Not one meaningful adjustment. Not one league-wide initiative to protect the face of women's basketball. Instead, she let it play out. Let Clark take the hits. Let the "let him play" narrative cover up what was really happening. A systematic campaign to break her down physically and mentally. The targeting was so blatant that even the national press couldn't ignore it. The Washington Post ran headlines warning the WNBA officiating itself had become a danger to the game. Fans flooded social media, calling it what it was, league-sanctioned punishment for being too popular, too dominant, too big for the system to handle. But inside the commissioner's office, silence. No apologies, no accountability. Just more smiling photos, more revenue reports, more record-breaking ticket sales announcements. And that silence, that refusal to act, was the first and perhaps most unforgivable betrayal. Because Engelbert had a choice. She could protect the player who was single-handedly carrying her league to new heights, or she could protect the broken system that allowed Clark to be targeted. She chose the system, and once she made that choice, there was no going back. Because the abuse didn't just damage Clark's body, it created a timeline of injuries that would ultimately destroy her season. And that's where this story turns from negligence into disaster. By this point, the targeting of Caitlin Clark wasn't some hidden conspiracy. It was obvious. Fans saw it every game, opposing players admitted to it, analysts broke it down on live television, and even major outlets like the Washington Post started publishing damning headlines about how WNBA officiating itself had become a direct threat to the integrity of the sport. The evidence was everywhere. So how did the league respond? With accountability? With reform? With a promise to finally protect the player who was holding up their entire financial structure? No. The league responded with gaslighting. Reporters asked tough questions about why Clark was taking brutal hits with no whistles. Instead of acknowledging reality, the commissioner's office fell back on carefully polished corporate speak answers, the kind of PR fluff designed to dismiss fans and players as if they were overreacting. The most common line? No one's ever happy with officiating. We're working hard. Let that sink in. A generational talent is being targeted night after night. Fans are outraged. Players are openly warning referees. And Engelbert's big response is, well, nobody likes the refs. That's not an answer. That's an insult. That's the equivalent of telling millions of paying fans, you're crazy. You're imagining things. Just keep buying tickets and stop asking questions. This became the league's official playbook under Engelbert. Deny, deflect, diminish. Don't acknowledge the targeting, don't admit mistakes, don't hold anyone accountable. Instead, use vague language, talk about dialogue and improvements, and bury the real issue under layers of PR polish. And here's the most sinister part. The gaslighting worked for a while. The constant corporate spin created just enough doubt, just enough fog, that critics could be painted as overdramatic. It bought Engelbert time. Time to keep counting the money while Clark's body was taking hit after hit.
But denial doesn't stop reality. The fouls didn't slow down. The injuries didn't disappear. The targeting didn't magically end because the commissioner said, "We're working on it." The truth was there every night for millions of fans to see, and the longer Engelbert refused to act, the more obvious it became that the league wasn't just neglecting its star, it was complicit in her destruction. This wasn't just bad leadership, it was betrayal disguised as professionalism. A smiling commissioner telling you everything was fine while her league's most valuable player was being physically dismantled in plain sight. And as we all know, ignoring a problem doesn't make it vanish, it makes it worse. Because what started as uncalled fouls and cheap shots quickly turned into something far more devastating, a season-ending injury that everyone saw coming, yet no one in power tried to prevent. When you look back at Caitlin Clark's 2025 season, it doesn't read like a normal injury log. It reads like a slow-motion train wreck. One that everyone saw coming, yet no one in power tried to stop. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a freak accident. It was the direct and predictable result of neglect. It started small. May 2025. A quad strain. Manageable, they said. Just a minor setback. But anyone who's followed sports long enough knows a quad strain is the kind of injury that screams overuse. Clark wasn't being protected, wasn't being given the space to recover between games. She was taking hits night after night, and her body was already showing signs of breaking down. Then came the next stage, repeated groin injuries, June, July, one after another. The kind of injuries that don't happen in isolation, they happen when the body is compensating, when one area is weakened and another takes the load. It was a domino effect, and every domino was falling exactly as predicted. By August, the damage had compounded into something far worse, a bone bruise. That's not the kind of injury that comes out of nowhere. That's the kind of injury that happens when the body has been battered for months, when it's been asked to perform under relentless physical abuse without proper recovery. And then came the breaking point, the announcement no fan wanted to hear, but deep down already expected. Caitlin Clark was out for the remainder of the 2025 season. Think about that. A two-time All-Star, the 2024 Rookie of the Year, the single most valuable player in the league's history of growth, gone after just 13 games. Not because of one unlucky fall, but because her body was systematically broken down over months of neglect and abuse. This wasn't a horror story of chance, it was a timeline of failure. Each hit stacked on the last, each foul that went uncalled, each foul that was ignored, pushed her closer to the inevitable. Fans could see it, players could feel it, reporters were already writing about it, yet the commissioner, the one person with the power to act, stood silent. And that silence is what turns this from tragedy into betrayal. Because this didn't have to happen. With real officiating reform, with genuine player protection, Caitlin Clark's season could have looked completely different. Instead, the WNBA's golden goose was left unprotected, beaten down until her body gave out. But the story doesn't stop there, because if Engelbert's first betrayal was ignoring the abuse, her second betrayal was even more cynical. When Clark went down, when the injuries piled up, the league didn't just stay silent, they lied directly to the fans who paid for tickets, who tuned into broadcasts, who believed Clark might still come back. And that's where this story goes from negligence to outright deception. If the first betrayal was Engelbert's silence while Caitlin Clark was being targeted on the court, the second betrayal was far more calculated and far more personal, because this time the league wasn't just abandoning its star player, it was lying directly to the people who kept the WNBA alive, the fans. Here's what happened. For nearly 8 weeks, Clark was listed as day-to-day. Every game, her name sat on the injury report. Sometimes she was marked probable, sometimes questionable, other times game-time decision. And every time, fans clung to hope. Maybe tonight would be the night. Maybe this would be her comeback. But here's the truth. Insiders knew she wasn't coming back. The injuries weren't minor setbacks. They weren't a strain that just needed a little rest. Medical professionals who saw the timeline said it plainly. This was a season-ending situation all along. Yet the Indiana Fever and the WNBA continued the charade week after week, stringing fans along with updates they knew were fiction. And why? One word: money. As long as Clark was day-to-day, fans kept buying tickets. Parents spent hundreds traveling across the country, bringing their kids to see the superstar who had inspired them to love the game. Broadcasters hyped up her potential return, keeping TV ratings inflated. Merchandise sales stayed hot because hope is a powerful product.
But behind the curtain, league officials knew it was all smoke and mirrors. One medical professional said it best. They could have said 2 months, evaluated in 6 weeks. Instead, they played this day-to-day nonsense for 8 weeks. That wasn't optimism. That wasn't caution. That was deception. And it wasn't harmless. Fans were scammed. Entire families bought road game tickets just for the chance to see Clark play, only to find out she was never going to step on the court. They poured their money, their time, their belief into a fantasy the league had already written off. The betrayal wasn't just about Clark's injury anymore. It was about manipulating the very people who had built the WNBA's momentum in the first place. This was Engelbert's second great failure. Not only had she allowed the face of her league to be battered into injury, she allowed her league to profit off of false hope. She turned Clark into a marketing tool even after her season was effectively over, milking her name and reputation while hiding the truth from the fans who deserved honesty. And when the lie finally collapsed, when the inevitable announcement came that Caitlin Clark was done for the season, the damage wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Fans felt cheated, trust evaporated overnight, and the league's credibility, the fragile foundation Engelbert had spent years selling, crumbled with it. But even then, the commissioner had one more chance to make it right, to step up, to admit mistakes, to own the failures of her league and promise real change. What happened next, though, was perhaps the most damning moment of all. Because instead of taking responsibility, Engelbert gave the one statement that confirmed what her priorities had been all along. When the truth finally broke, when it became undeniable that Caitlin Clark's season was over, all eyes turned to Commissioner Cathy Engelbert. This was her moment to lead, to admit mistakes, to take accountability, to promise fans and players that real reform was coming. But instead of addressing officiating failures, instead of acknowledging the lies around Clark's injury timeline, Engelbert released a polished corporate statement. No apology, no accountability, just talk about expansion, revenue streams, and constructive dialogue. And that silence, that refusal to speak on the real issue, was her confession. She didn't need to admit it out loud. By focusing on business while her league's brightest star was broken, Engelbert revealed exactly what mattered most to her. Not the players, not the fans, the money. That was her confession, and it told the world everything we needed to know. The moment Caitlin Clark was officially ruled out for the season, the entire WNBA house of cards came crashing down. What Commissioner Engelbert had sold as the league's golden era was instantly exposed for what it really was, a fragile empire built on the back of one player. And without her, the numbers turned into a nightmare. Overnight, ticket prices for major games collapsed. The most dramatic drop came at the NBA All-Star Weekend, where resale prices fell nearly 50% the moment Clark's withdrawal was confirmed. What had been billed as a must-see event suddenly became just another game, stripped of its star power. Television ratings were no better. National broadcasts that once spiked to record highs plummeted by more than 50% in Clark's absence. Broadcasters who had been cashing in on the Clark effect were left scrambling, filling airtime with excuses and empty analysis. And behind closed doors, advertisers started asking tough questions. What happens to their investment if the WNBA can't keep its biggest star on the court? Even sports media, which had cautiously cheered Engelbert's so-called leadership for years, turned on the league. Colin Cowherd, one of the loudest voices in American sports, said the quiet part out loud. People don't talk about the WNBA when Caitlin Clark isn't playing. The narrative shifted almost overnight. The league's momentum wasn't sustainable growth. It was a one-person show, and Engelbert had let that one person collapse. But the real collapse didn't come from the numbers. It came from the fans. The very people who bought tickets week after week, who tuned into games in record numbers, who defended Clark against every cheap shot and foul, they felt betrayed. And betrayal cuts deeper than disappointment. On social media, the anger was everywhere. Fans demanded refunds for road games where Clark had been falsely listed as day-to-day. Boycotts started gaining traction, with entire groups vowing to drain playoff ratings in protest. Parents who had taken their kids to see Clark play spoke out, furious that the league had knowingly sold them a lie. And once that trust is gone, it doesn't come back easily. The WNBA wasn't just facing the loss of its biggest star, it was facing the collapse of the fragile bond it had built with the public. For years, the league had begged for attention, begged for respect. Caitlin Clark delivered it in one season. But when the league chose money and deception over honesty and protection, it lost something far more valuable: credibility. And in that vacuum, with fans outraged, ticket prices falling, and ratings collapsing, a darker question began to take shape. A question whispered among insiders, spreading louder with each passing week. A question that turns this story from neglect into something far more sinister.
By now, the facts are undeniable. Caitlin Clark was targeted. She was battered on the court. She was misled off it. Fans were deceived, money was squeezed, and when it all came crashing down, the commissioner gave nothing but silence and corporate spin. Negligence? Absolutely. Betrayal? Without question. But what if it wasn't just negligence? What if it wasn't just failure? What if it was something darker? That's the question whispers are raising behind the scenes, a question too disturbing to ignore. Was this entire ordeal not simply the result of incompetence, but a calculated decision, a choice made at the very top to humble the league's biggest star? Think about it. In just 4 weeks, Caitlin Clark accomplished more for the WNBA than Cathy Engelbert had in 4 years. Ticket sales, television deals, national conversation. Suddenly, the balance of power in women's basketball wasn't sitting in the commissioner's office anymore. It was sitting in the hands of a 23-year-old player whose name alone could move markets. And for someone like Engelbert, who had built her reputation on leading the league into a new era, that kind of power shift was dangerous. Clark wasn't just the face of the WNBA. She was becoming bigger than the league itself, bigger than Engelbert. And history shows us that institutions rarely let individuals outgrow them without a fight. So here's the chilling possibility. Was Clark's treatment on the court simply tolerated incompetence? Or was it encouraged? Did Engelbert and her inner circle see the constant cheap shots and the escalating injuries as a way to keep their star in check? A way to remind her, and the fans, who really runs the league? We can't say that for certain. Not yet. But the whispers are growing louder. Sources close to players are starting to talk. Insiders are hinting that the lack of protection wasn't just neglect, it was policy. That officials weren't just bad at their jobs, they were told to let them play, no matter the cost. And the cost was Caitlin Clark, her season, her body, her trust. Maybe even the trust of millions of fans. If that's true, then this isn't just the story of a star betrayed. It's the story of a league that deliberately destroyed its own golden era before it had even begun. Not by accident, not by mistake, but by design. We don't have the full answer yet, but make no mistake, the truth is coming. And when it does, it won't just expose what happened to Caitlin Clark. It will expose the WNBA itself.